Satoru Gojo, the acclaimed strongest sorcerer of the modern era, has been tried and tested against basically every main matchup, whether that be Goku, Naruto, Saitama, etc. But what if the strongest sorcerer ran into the strongest Uchiha? Both have eyes that transcend the world of power around them and are pretty unique, so who would actually win? Well, let's find out. Shoot for 20k, let's go. Before the strongest being the world had ever really conceived of returned, exploding the body and creating literal geysers of chakra stronger than the 10 tails of a more powerful Madara than the one who could summon over 20 of these same Chubaku Tensei meteors that literally drained the lifespan of a man who destroyed an entire country, with the amount of force Madara used being calculated to be around moon level, far higher than when Madara destroyed all the continent nuking Biju at the same time. Sasuke would continue fighting alongside Naruto, who housed Kurama, the largest part of the Ten Tails, said to be capable of turning the entire planet to ash. Sasuke and Naruto having gained the greatest powers according to a 15-year anniversary guide from Hiromo, the Sage of Six Paths, with Sasuke now being able to fight alongside Naruto, whose Six Paths chakra is now being amplified via his KCM2 cloak, which alone is an amp at least far beyond KCM1, which was such a speed boost that it made it so Naruto couldn't even react to his own sheer speed, hence to why he could move roughly 70 times faster than the light speed Raikage. Yet Sasuke can still acclimate to this Naruto, who, albeit maybe slightly physically more imposing than Sasuke. Concerning a meaningful fight, however, this is virtually irrelevant, as we know when the two are fighting the aforementioned Madara, Naruto was struggling to cause any significant damage, fighting equally to the limbo and having multiple offensive corals halted by that very Madara. Yet Sasuke, on the other hand, was able to completely swap out Madara, stabbing him through the chest and even blitzing across the battlefield to slice Madara in half. No exaggeration, Sasuke massively outperformed Naruto regarding a ratio of damage done to damage taken per se. Even as Naruto continues to press Kaguya, the aforementioned threat far beyond Madara, whose chakra was such that Sasuke couldn't even conceive of a being like this actually existing, and despite her threatening to destroy her entire set of time spaces, Sasuke was still keeping up with and eventually evolving his power to such that he could be confident in stopping another Kaguya level threat, presuming it ever threatens the peace they so desperately fought for. With this also being quite consistent if you take the novelization of The Last, which states that Sasuke is Kakashi's strongest student. And now, before positing just how strong this asserts Sasuke to actually be, and arguing between solar system and universal, I think it's pretty crucial to note Gojo's possible AP first, so you can see why that's not really that relevant. Now, while many people will immediately assume the argument of Gojo scaling to at least island level due to Dagon's domain expansion, I think to prove this point, let's just take Gojo's AP to the highest ends possible, right? That are at least realistic, that is. And there's a few different statements of the kind where, if a cursed spirit were to consume all of Sukuna's fingers, they'd be capable of destroying the world as they know it. And while this could be in reference to society, as the diction "as we know" could possibly allude to such, I think it's fair to also posit that other characters like Kenjaku will make that sort of distinction between world and society when it's needed. And I mean, think of it like this, right? Gojo can scale above basically every sorcerer on the planet, and has been shown to literally obliterate Toji and his worm thing, which is stated to house a fourth dimensional space in his mouth, alluding to him being a dual spatial phenomenon. Taking this, Gojo could then destroy a 3D door to a 4D space. How relevant that actually is, who knows. There are other characters still that can create literal black holes, so planetary for Gojo isn't too absurd, you know what I mean? Although, admittedly, those who want to posit that this is a star as opposed to like an action highlight in Dagon's domain is probably a bit far-fetched, all things considered, but you could take it as a star, I guess. So, as noted, arguing about whether Sasuke ought to scale to solar system or universal doesn't really matter at all, although you should give the same charity to each fighter depending on if you take the higher or lower interpretation. If you go with a island level Gojo, then go with a planetary Sasuke. If you go with a star level Gojo, then go with a universal Sasuke, etc. But let's be completely transparent. No matter what you say, if Sasuke gets his hands on Gojo, then the death sentence has already been signed. And as for Gojo, it's probably a similar thing in how he applies his mathematical and spatial manipulative powers, so let's discuss the real meat and potatoes. What y'all really want. Could Sasuke pass the infinity? What is the infinity? Well, let's find out in a bit more of an advanced discussion. Gojo's Limitless is an ability that denies the traditional understanding of motion mathematically via exploiting finite distances as a means for creating the idea and usage of infinity. As I'm sure you all know, having probably heard Gojo's Limitless 1,000 times and probably heard of the deep abyss mathematical complexities such as those derived from Shonen Jump Giga Summer 2021 magazine special that utilized two special grade mathematicians to ultimately determine or attempt to determine how might Gojo be manipulating the space around him in the way that he does. Now, in this magazine, and I won't promise, look, this won't take too long, just stick with me, it'll help you understand the ability. Mr. Hino, who is a mathematical professor, he makes a pretty sharp comparison to Gojo's ability of that of Riemann's theorem, which is essentially the same splitting of areas of distances, just not directly into halfway points, where the magazine details it as follows, quote, if you view one frame as 0.1 of a page, you get 10 frames. If you view it as 0.01 second slices, you get 100 frames. If you keep making the units smaller, 0.000001, and you keep increasing the number of zeros, the number of frames can become arbitrarily large. To which Mr. Hino supplements with the claim that there's no end to counting the steps until you arrive. Since time can be arbitrarily subdivided, you could split time into infinitely many frames, and if you count them, there's no limit. So the idea of approaching is that there's a sequence of points. Slowing down is the heart of it. You see, Gojo is simply bringing mathematical concepts in that he is essentially just dividing space infinitely to create, in a technical sense, an infinite distance that must be traveled to actually hit Gojo. It's not like a wall, though the fanbook does describe it as a barrier or barrier-like. Just like how both Gege Akutami and Gojo himself analogize it in the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, which I know you've heard. The faster runner can never beat a tortoise with a head start in a race due to him having to reach where the tortoise was. By that time, he would be at a new distance, and the runner would have to go to that distance, and he'd have to do this an infinite number of times. Basically, when Gojo shows the Limitless in his fingers, he's literally showing an infinite distance, or an infinite distance of halfway points that he's brought forth into reality, because, as he says, the infinity's always there, he's just kind of making it real or tangible, whatever. Look, you guys get how it works. So the true question, right? The true meat is, how does Sasuke interact with this? Well, that's actually quite interesting, as while, yes, we alluded to Sasuke already being far beyond the speed of light, I would like to preface that this alone doesn't inherently conclude that he bypassed infinity, due to Miguel's statement of Gojo manipulating space on an atomic level, and obviously photons are smaller than atoms, thus would negate it, hence why light would also just pass through it, and hence why you could even see Gojo. And this is heavily consistent, but this doesn't mean that if you're above the speed of light, you'll just blitz through it because you're not the size of a photon, obviously, right? And while this actually is heavily consistent with other Jujutsu sorcerers, like the revived Yorozu being able to create a perfect sphere, which is understood by most experts to be basically impossible within the theorizing that atoms with a temperature of absolute zero could be perfect for maybe a glimpse of time, supporting the manipulation of space on an atomic level being pretty consistent for the series. But what does this actually mean for Sasuke? Well, it's actually pretty unique in terms of how, they would actually interact. For example, while many people point to Gojo's innate ability to speak and move when trapped in time due to his infinity, as well, Sasuke can kind of do this with his Rinnegan. It allows for him to literally visualize Momoshiki's time swap and actually see it when everything is stopped. And it gets even crazier than this, as his Rinnegan, even in its premature state, can perceive the aforementioned Limbo clones, which are hailed as imperceptible phantoms residing in an entirely different reality that's merely adjacent to our own. And while this sounds crazy, Naruto himself, whose 6-pass Sage mode is meant to be a relative to Sasuke's vision in his Rinnegan, could command the principles of all creation. as when, he is either unconsciously floating or creating an entirely new eyeball out of naught or stopping the 8th gate of death. And despite this, it's probably more difficult for Sasuke to bypass the infinity than what you might presume, as I think while many have already said Genjutsu likely won't work on Gojo, as he would be probably stopping the chakra that is coming towards him to enter his ocular nerves, seeing as the traveling ocular chakra simply won't reach past the infinity. And we'll tie this back in later, but there's a few different things I think that he might be able to use to get past it. The first of the which is Amaterasu, something praised equally to even the Flying Raijin in Data Book 2, which also states, quote, its flames appear pitch black, yet burn with a heat like the sun, which actually doesn't have the said to diction to the following points in this page, where it also notes that its heat is so powerful it's, quote, enough to incinerate even a person's internal organs in an instant, something pretty detrimental to Gojo if it were to hit him. And while many people would firstly resort to the age-old consensus that it travels, seen as the Raikage A, the hailed fastest man on the planet at the time, could dodge it, this is Sasuke with his base MS, and unironically, it doesn't actually ever happen again as far as I'm aware, besides only 2 other times when he uses it with just his base MS against Danzo and Gyuki, who both react to it. So each time it's used in his base MS form, it's reacted to. And while you may say, but Virtue, the Amaterasu doesn't change if it gets the EMS, that may be true, but we don't actually know that. The only 2 possible examples of such ever being the case would be for both Madara and Sasuke, with the former of the which never giving us any glimpse of what his MS ability was, much less how it changed, meaning it's only Sasuke, and thus, what do we really know? Well, to your surprise, alongside Volume 61, Kishimoto wrote a full guidebook to supplement the release of the Naruto Road to Ninja movie, with the guide housing the same authorship style to all 4 databooks, plus a Q&A interview section. Concerning Sasuke, this guidebook states, the Mangekyo Sharingan, a powerful Sharingan that grants techniques like Susanoo and Amaterasu. By transplanting Itachi's eyes, Sasuke stabilized and perfected its abilities, awakening the eternal Mangekyo Sharingan, which actually very well could imply that the greater the ocular prowess is actually enhancing the abilities, raw might themselves. And furthermore, we know this to be the case with the Susanoo, as Fanbook 2 states that Itachi has the ultimate absolute defense, which is a categorical term typically applied to Gaara's Sand, Neji's Rotation, and even Sasuke's Summit Susanoo, where now it's Sasuke with his bare bones, fresh EMS, who has surpassed his previous ocular abilities, now having his own ultimate absolute defense. We know his basic Genjutsu can now completely match Itachi's Tsukiyomi, which was stated to be a far cry in the Summit, and his Enton is now hailed as the greatest offensive ocular ability, where we now see that, as to parallel his attacks during the Summit, Sasuke has Amaterasu on his Susanoo and tosses it out in whiffs against the opponent. And his MS form, he can only toss out 3, where now in his initial EMS, again, no training, no practice, he can use 5. But what would you expect? We see, for example, that the basic Sharingan allows for greater chakra to be utilized in the Fireball, according to some earlier anime guidebooks. But look, all I'm saying is the best summed up explanation is by Databook 4. Quote, the transplanted eye of Itachi lit an eternal light within the Mangekyo Sharingan, granting Sasuke ninjutsu and dojutsu that surpass even his brothers. But don't worry, let's not stop there. How about we glance at 2 and arguably 4 solid examples for why the Amaterasu's development might actually be the case and what that even means. In chapter 657, we open to Madara standing in a large smoke cloud, being revived into the body he so desperately desired, where all of a sudden the Amaterasu appears on Madara. But let's take a closer look. If you zoom in here, you can actually see that Madara is invisible in the smoke, and the only reason why you would think this is because of the page prior, except that that page is meant to show Madara being revived and thus couldn't properly display the smoke, unless you want to say that he was covered in smoke, revived, then Sasuke hit the Amaterasu, and then immediately after the smoke reformed. But like, come on, this is a bit silly. The Amaterasu's height also above Madara's head supports the fact that Sasuke hit him without seeing him. Furthermore, or at least only seeing him with the Sharingan, I should note. Furthermore, if you really want to get into it, we know that there's a conceptually dependent aspect of the Amaterasu. Like, for example, right, the Amaterasu only works insofar as it burns on targeted things. Like, we know Itachi misfires it off the roof and hits the trees, which don't actually burn. Sasuke hits the Raikage, but since it hit the cloak, it never actually really burned him. Why? Because the target wasn't the cloak, it was A. Similarly, Madara has a new body, and Sasuke can't see him without, the Sharingan. He's only seen his chakra network, so what would be the only conceptual thing he would consider? The armor, which is the only thing that burns, as opposed to Madara's lion mane hairdo, which was basically part of the same exact spot, virtually speaking. Sasuke prior to this, however, did look at the Rasen Shuriken when he used it on there, so of course I'm not claiming it's just conceptual, it's not really visual, because look, it is visual, but maybe it's more conceptually dependent than what we've been giving it credit. Look at when he uses it against Kaguya. Pay attention to both of these examples. The first is when he uses it here as a diversionary tactic. His eye does not bleed and it serves its sole purpose. However, after this, once they're stuck in Kaguya's ice, which was so dense that even Naruto's TSO could barely trudge through it, Sasuke uses his Amaterasu and his eye bleeds and the flame instantly consumes the ice. Now, I'm not even going to argue that this wasn't in his technical line of sight, which is actually arguable, as you could see here if you just draw the line. It's clear that the likely point of origin wasn't in his line of sight, or at least it's very awkward to say that it was, but regardless, we can just say that it's possible. Meaning that in both this example and the one that hit Madara, we know that there's a high probability of a greater than visual targeting, and coincidentally, his eyes bled in both scenes. And both diversionary attacks against Kaguya and even Jibito, if you want to go farther back, they didn't bleed at all. In both instances where they were just visually targeted, they didn't bleed. When they were more conceptually targeted, they did, which could ultimately allude to the notion of the more conceptually targeted Amaterasu being more taxing, but the less aggressive and more diversionary Amaterasu being both visual but also no blood, so perhaps less taxing. Now look, this may seem tangential, and this is kind of giving a lot of charity to Sasuke, but it could most certainly allude to Sasuke being able to appear the Amaterasu onto Gojo. And if you're still skeptical, you could argue that theoretically the chakra would just go through infinity because it goes through this ice, but it really depends on A, how thick you think the ice is, and B, whether or not you think the chakra travels at a photonic size. It's kind of arguable. I probably don't. Although perhaps another argument that could be made is that the chakra utilized, similarly to the Genjutsu chakra, as I said I'd come back to, in and of itself wouldn't inherently be threatening and would thus not be stopped by infinity. Like how when a pencil and an eraser are both thrown at Gojo simultaneously, it only halts the pencil, viewing it as threatening. So this is a possible argument, and we know the chakra that does traverse it to the brain, and the potentially traveling chakra for the Amaterasu aren't typically seen by the Sharingan, which even the 3 Tomoe state can view microscopic nanobombs. So perhaps Gojo's brain wouldn't logically detect these as chakra signals, or these chakra signals like as threatening, but that's even if he can perceive them. So that's an argument. Regardless, we know that the Emenoteja Kara is also conceptually dependent, as he uses it without seeing the object, such as against Kinshiki, for example. And he also does it against Madara here. All this to say that Sasuke could hit and obviously kill Gojo, depending primarily on how you think these two work concerning both vision and conceptualization. If you do subscribe to the latter, then Sasuke should be able to swap Gojo into the Amaterasu itself, like how Minato teleports with an attack in the person's body. If your understanding of the Emenoteja Kara is less than that of Minato's Flying Raijin, then you should probably let's go back a note, right? When Minato stated to have a technique that essentially is capable of cracking open time and space to then send an object through a subspace connected by 2 Flying Raijin markers, with Data Book 3 stating that it transcends concepts like space and distance, whereas Sasuke's is never stated to have any sort of subspace interaction and is truly just swapping out the opponent. We also can know this to be the case as Madara, without the Ten Tails, was able to sense Tobirama's Flying Raijin before it happened and even dodge it, but Sasuke's Emenoteja Kara could completely blitz him, swapping a sword into Madara's stomach. meaning that Sasuke has a teleportation ability that is beyond the conceptual transcendence of the Flying Raijin. So Sasuke should theoretically swap Gojo into attacks via this, bypass the infinity in a way. If not, then Gojo could probably win via something like Immeasurable Void, which just overloads the brain with infinite information, which is a better win con than Hollow Purple, seeing as while it's commonly thought to be existence erasure, it probably doesn't, as it has a really clear like singe and searing effect to it. It's not actually just erasing things at all, such as against Sukuna. So yeah, while Gojo does lose to, like Goku, right? Obviously, he probably is more powerful than, what the common crazy matches allude to, right? He's always put up against these universal, massively faster than light characters, and I'm not saying Sasuke isn't, but he actually is stronger than what we think, and I actually think that this one could probably go either way. It just kind of comes down to how you subscribe to the conceptual aspects of the Amaterasu and the Rinnegan swap, which I don't really think the latter is all that debatable. I would also like to make a few notes that Gojo is presumably fighting a perfect game with the Infinity, although in universe, he doesn't exactly do this, allowing the Infinity to take a lesser precedent so he can engage in more hand-to-hand confrontational bouts, such as against Sukuna or arguably even against Jogo. So the usage of Infinity, insofar as we're applying, is like the perfect application for it. No pride taken into account really at all. If it were take a lesser precedent, then obviously Sasuke would just blitz and one-shot Gojo, with Sasuke having innumerable other methods to kill him if he doesn't have the Infinity, with his Susanoo, for example, being now like a level only equal to like Madara's in terms of pure mastery, using just his hand to block Senbon from Kaguya herself, and fighting the same Naruto avatar that could completely obliterate the world, and honestly, more depending on your aforementioned interpretations of Kaguya. But what did you guys think? Do you hold to Gojo clearly decimating Sasuke, or do you actually think that Sasuke would just instantly punch right through the Infinity with his pure might? Either way, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe if you like this type of content and want some more JJK type videos. I'd also like to give a shout out to Jaded, who's done this video in the past. It's a pretty good educational video, so check that out if you like it. But more importantly than that, may God bless you all. Love you guys.